It's early morning. Unfortunately for us, it's in the afternoon. And so many people tend to do other things in the afternoon. Thank you very much, Abby, for joining us. We heard some presentations this morning on the Chinese economy, but I'm sure that with your expertise and knowledge, you're going to shed much more light. Here it says already, Abby Joseph Cohen, Goldman Sachs, telephone number, and I would add to that Abby is also a grandmother to, a very sweet baby, not baby anymore, in Tel Aviv, Ramat Gan, Tel Aviv. And the mother was working at the INSS as a researcher. And Abby, the microphone, the video, the Skype, whatever it is yours. Please.
Okay. Oded, thank you. I'm always pleased to be able to work with INSS. Kobe, if I could just mention that there's some feedback on the audio, so perhaps if you can lower the volume, that would help. This is such an important topic that you are addressing today, and one that I have done much work on. The materials that you see in the PowerPoint presentation are materials that we present to our clients, not just in Israel and China, but around the world, because we think that this is such an important topic in terms of looking at economic growth, innovation, and also the capital flows. In this global economy, we always need to look at not just what is happening on the ground in terms of what's being built and what's being produced, but we also have to look at what's being created in terms of intellectual property, what's being done in terms of innovation, but also the money that flows from country to country to help support them. In the first page of the handout, there is a table that shows, just very simply to get us started, the economic growth expectations for various nations. And what you can see there is that the United States has been in an extremely stable pattern for the last several years. Our growth is averaging between 2 and 2.5% real GDP. And one of the important aspects of that is that with growth at that level, our companies are quite profitable, they're generating a lot of cash flow, and they are picking up the pace of their investment. Some of the aggregate investment numbers look a little odd because we're not spending as much as we did previously on buildings, but we're spending a lot more on equipment and research and development and so on. You can also see the data for other nations, including Israel, but take a look, please, at China. While many people are concerned about this slowdown in economic activity in China, just a few years ago, real GDP growth, as I'm sure you are all aware, was about 12%. We believe that the new ongoing sustainable growth rate for China is about 6%, which is very impressive, given that China has grown dramatically in size, and given as well that so much has already been invested in infrastructure in China. And now an increasing portion of this growth in China is coming from ongoing growth, consumer demand, and also investment in other issues. I would ask that you turn to page 3, the handout, because the more important aspect for us to address is long-term economic growth, which is, of course, related to long-term investment in 2 important areas. Labor is always at the top of the list. Is there an educated public? Are people being encouraged? Asaf, is there a question?
No, we're trying to synchronize the slides. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So the R&D relative to GDP shows you how much every country is willing to invest in these important categories. And we have put arrows next to the three countries of discussion this morning. Israel really is a standout. The United States is now sort of in the middle of the pack, and then comes China. Most of my discussion today will be about Israel and China, but let me spend a moment on the United States. The U.S. still is number one in the world by a very large margin if you look at the number of dollars being spent on R&D. But we have such a large economy, when you divide R&D by GDP, the number doesn't look as impressive. However, for many, many years, the U.S. ratio of R&D to GDP was what it is now for Israel. We used to be at 4 to 4.5%, and we're now down to 2.5%. It was that period of dramatic investment in R&D as a percentage of the economy that gave us our lengthy period of robust gains in labor productivity and also very rapid growth of GDP. So when we take a look at long-term economic prospects in any country, we start here. How much is being invested? The short-term investment, the long-term investment. And we see here that Israel, but as many in the room I'm sure are aware, is that the sources of this investment in Israel are somewhat unusual, where a good deal of it is coming not from Israeli companies or other Israeli sources, but rather much of it is coming from non-Israeli companies. Israel has been a magnet for this sort of investment, and that's a good thing. The fact that major U.S. companies, major European companies are coming and doing their R&D in Israel is, I think, a certification of optimism for the sort of work that is being done. If we look at the next page, we can see changes over the last 10 years in this ratio. And here we see that Israel is not as pronounced a standout as it was previously. Korea is. And so when we do our global analysis, we do see that there is very dramatic investment in this area in Israel and Korea. And by the way, the overall Korean investment, GDP, R&D to GDP, is about as high in Korea as it is in Israel. Please turn to page 5, where you can look at where that investment money is going. And here, too, we see some unusual things. Here, China is a little bit unusual because China is actually doing less basic research as a percentage of its total than some of these other countries. We have basic research, which think of as the scientific progress. Then we have research and development, which is how do you take that basic science and turn it into something that will directly benefit economic growth and something that has a commercial application. And then, of course, there is development. And what we see here is that China has been somewhat lagging in terms of the way the money that they spend is portioned in terms of the basic research. I think it helps explain why China has increasingly come to Israel and some other countries looking for that extra benefit. Page 6 tells a similar interesting story for Israel. Here we're looking at scientists and engineers as a percentage of the labor force. Again, if we just look at the number of scientists and engineers, there are other countries that would look quite well because of very large populations. But when we look at how many people in a nation are trained to do the basic research, to do the early stage R&D and so on, we see, of course, that Israel is quite a standout. And this is yet another reason for the traction. The United States, again, this is adjusted by size of labor force, is a little bit above the middle of the pack. We used to be number one in the world for many decades. China is not doing well in this category, but as I suspect you have already heard today, the Chinese government is focusing very heavily on this as a priority goal for long-term economic growth in China, the creation of educational institutions, the encouragement of higher education, and let me, of course, point out the establishment of the Technion campus in Guangdong province. There is a real desire by China to step it up in terms of making these long-term investments, not just in R&D, but also in people. Israel has already done a great deal of that. Page 7 is some data on innovation in which countries around the world are ranked. And this information comes from the World Economic Forum. You'll notice that there is a line that moves across, and in the northeast quadrant are the nations that do quite well in terms of innovation. And many of them are nations that are growing primarily because of long-term investment and creativity. At the southwest quadrant are the nations typically that have done well because they have focused on low-cost production. In the northeast quadrant, you see the United States, which we've circled, Israel, Switzerland, and Japan. The one for me that's quite interesting here is China. And you may say, well, it's not that high up on the scale. If I was to show you these data from 10 years ago, China would have been at the bottom, in which almost all of the economic growth was coming from low-cost production. And now as that economy in some sectors is becoming more sophisticated, we see that they are moving up on this line. The next page is sort of fun. This comes again from another survey about innovation. This is one that looks at 140 different countries, many different variables, and they rank the nations according to how they score on these different factors. And we have circled the ones where a nation is ranked within the top 5. And you'll see that the United States excels in many areas. This includes, very importantly, the contribution by our financial markets. Having open capital markets, having venture capital available and so on, is viewed as a very important element in the creation of innovation. I would point out that when we look around the world in terms of where VC money, venture capital money is being directed, it's to the United States, and Israel is number 2. You'll also see that China has done well in not that many categories here, but has improved in recent years. Israel is really, to me, quite a standout given the size of the country. It's not just the access to capital, again, from largely international flows, but the one that I like here very much is the linkage between basic research, innovation, and what happens in the economy. That, to me, is really essential. Where Israel has been extraordinary, and the universities, the government have been important in this, has been not just creating the scientific research, but trying to decide what to do with it. There are some other factors here. For those who are interested, I'm happy to send you the link to the basic source information. Page 9 shows the money that is available in the United States for investment. This is the cash flow year by year by the largest companies, the S&P 500 in the United States. And while there was a dip, obviously, during the global financial crisis and the recession, what we see has been very dramatic growth in that cash available for investment. And one of the things that we often tell our U.S. corporate clients is that many of them need to be investing more in the long term. If we go back several years, we see that about 70% of U.S. cash generated each year was devoted to long-term growth, CapEx, R&D, and so on. And we've now gone from 70% to about 58%. That's not bad in terms of international comparisons, but we think the U.S. could be doing better in this regard. The next topic I'd like to touch on is trade. On page 10, we have a table that shows U.S. trade, and I presented here just for comparison's sake. You can see that in the first column, we're showing the relationship of the United States to other nations. This is U.S. exports to these other nations. The second set of columns are U.S. imports from those other nations, and you can see where we have trade imbalances and so on. I would point out that despite what you might hear in terms of political rhetoric, there are two facts. Number one, the U.S. trade deficit is actually much smaller now than it has been for many, many years. And number two, the so-called deficits that we have, for example, with our trade partners in North America, i.e. Mexico, a lot of this is supply chain. It is not really appropriate in our view to look at bilateral trade relationships. That's not the way this world works. If we look at the next page, there's a focus on China, and here you can analyze it as well. What you can see is that by a very significant margin, most of the direct investment that China is doing is within Asia, but we've also shown you the investment in Israel. So much of that investment is coming in the form of infrastructure spending, the involvement by China in things that are essential, be it the light rail in Tel Aviv, the Carmel tunnels, and so on. That is really quite important. But the other thing I'd like to focus on is the money that flows in the opposite direction. And while we've talked about trade, there's one more page to show you, and this is page 12. This is a somewhat unfamiliar way to look at trade. We're looking at value add to see which countries are really most important to China. And you can see that the ones that are on the left-hand side of the scale are basically the countries in Asia, East Asia. And the United States and Israel are, again, sort of in the middle of the pack, but much less important to China. What this doesn't show is the prospective capital flows in both directions. And while we do see that there's Chinese investment into Israel, not just infrastructure, but also high tech, be it the investments in biotech, agri-tech, water tech, and so on, the opportunity also obviously exists in the opposite direction in terms of direct Israeli export to China. And while we always like to talk about high tech, whether it is IT or biotech, medtech, and so on, I want to finish my presentation by reminding all of us that there are problems in the world that need to be solved. And I'm going to address two of them. They are related. One is water, and the other is environment and climate. On page 13, we're showing a representation of water withdrawals around the world. And Israel, of course, is a great expert on water withdrawals. Right now, the biggest water withdrawals usages in the world are China and India. Much of this is related to population. And if we turn to page 14, this is a chart that shows, okay, they're the ones who are using the water. Where is the water? And here we're looking at water on a per capita basis. There's one standout country over on the left-hand side, that's Canada. For those of you who've visited Canada, you know it is very green. They have a lot of water. They also have very few people. So if we take a look at the right-hand side, we see nations that are water challenged. India, China, and then of course, the Middle East. And we always like to say in economics that challenges create opportunities. Clearly that has been the case in Israel with the extraordinarily amazing development of water tech in the country. And what we see, we believe, is an opportunity that has already been realized to a large extent, but not completely, in terms of exports and an economic relationship based upon the need for this water tech. And by the way, while today's discussion is about China, there are also enormous opportunities because of India. And then I would ask you to look at my last page. If we look at environmental damage, and we always like to think about carbon footprint, and can address that if you like, I'm showing you here something that we often forget to look at, and that's particulate emissions. And over on the right-hand side, you're looking at the cities, this is done by cities of the world that have the lowest problem with particulate emissions. And it is basically the large cities that many of you may be familiar with. New York, Sydney, London. And why this is so incredible to me is you think back just a few decades and hundreds of people dying in London because of the enormous pollution from coal. Many of these nations, including the United States, have cleaned up its act with regard to the use of dirty carbon. And despite what you might hear from certain political leaders, coal will not be growing in the United States. Yes, a few years ago, part of the problem that the coal industry faced was related to environmental regulations. That's not the issue now. The issue now is that coal is not competitive. It costs too much, both on a direct basis and also an indirect basis. And so the growth in energy usage in the United States is coming, yes, some of it is natural gas from shale, an awful lot of it is also coming from alternative energy sources. If you look at the other side of this chart, you'll see the dirtiest nations on the planet. And again, we're doing this by city. And you can see that it is the large cities in China and India that are facing the biggest problems, in large part because China and India are still using a significant amount of coal for their energy, electricity generation. Not only do we think there's an opportunity for water tech in the world, we also think that there's an opportunity for clean energy tech. Some of that involves cleanup, but some of it also involves this movement over to using alternative sources of energy, taking a look at some of the trade relationships, Israel, China, on things like solar usage, quite impressive. And we think that it's going to be the cleaner forms of energy, including natural gas, which is much cleaner than coal, that will help determine who can grow on a sustainable basis economically over the next few decades. And with that, Oded, I'm going to stop. And you let me know if there are questions, please.
Many thanks, Abby. There is one, at least from my side, and that relates to the page on trade and the famous campaign of the candidate Trump and the actions that President Trump took on the issue of the deficit in the balance of trade between China and the United States. I thought that the figure is a bit larger than what appeared in your presentation. When I looked at the figures of 2016, it was $350 billion, but what is $10 billion between you and me? But well over 300, to say the least. So was the candidate Trump right in making this a serious issue in the campaign? And is the sort of compromise which he reached when the Chinese president visited him in Mar-a-Lago, is it an answer, or are we only in the beginning of what could be developed into a trade war?
Oded, I'm going to answer your question directly after I just point out that the data on trade that I presented are for the last 12 months. So we're looking at a slightly different time frame. And now let me answer your question very clearly. I believe that President Trump has made a terrible mistake with regard to U.S. trade relationships with China. First of all, withdrawing the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I believe, will prove to be one of the biggest foreign policy and economic policy errors of many, many years. Why? Because this world is all about supply chain, and the TPP, despite his campaign rhetoric, did not involve China directly. It was, in fact, a trade pact that was the United States and other nations that have borders, if you will, on the Pacific Ocean, including Canada and Mexico and Latin America. So for all of his complaints about NAFTA, it was actually TPP, which was the renegotiation of NAFTA. It included very tight environmental standards. Let me not say very tight, tighter than NAFTA, environmental standard, tighter standard on child labor, tighter standards on worker safety. The other participants in TPP include many nations in East Asia. And these are the nations that were looking for a way to reduce the dominance of China in their own long-term economic plan. They wanted to build good economic relationships with the United States. By withdrawing from the TPP, I believe the United States has made a mistake because it is now China that will be the dominant player in these talks, and it will exclude the United States, number one. Number two, President Trump likes to talk about bilateral trade relationships. This is straight out of economic theory of the 19th century and not the 21st century. And number three, I believe another mistake made by the Trump administration has been the withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Accords. There are people in the room who know that climate has been an area of one area of my research focus over the last decade. And I believe that the Paris Accord, while it was so-called non-binding, was the single most important pact out there that we have ever reached as a global community. And the reason was that China and the United States sat down for the first time, and China agreed for the first time to admit that they needed to do something. I would point out they were already doing quite a lot. If you look at Chinese infrastructure, for example, on electricity generation, they were already moving towards cleaner plants and so on. But for the United States to withdraw from the Paris Accord, something that had been led by the United States, represents to me the U.S. withdrawing from the international community as it moves forward on many of these important decisions. And by the way, not just on the environment, but I also think withdrawal from the Trade Pact, TPP, withdrawal from the Paris Accord does not send a positive message to our allies.
Thank you, Abby, and have a good day. And we hope to hear from you in our next meeting.
Thank you.